The sun had long since vanished beneath the horizon, leaving behind a blood-red sky that cast eerie shadows across the desolate streets. A sharp wind whispered through the cracked windows of abandoned cars, pushing litter across the pavement. The city, once alive with the bustle of human activity, now felt like a hollow shell, a ghost town that echoed with the distant creaking of crumbling buildings. There were no screams. No cries for help. No frantic footsteps or hurried voices. Only the relentless ticking of time, marking the passing of a world that had once thrived. The streets were empty, but they were not silent. Beneath the stillness, the air was thick with the weight of something unspeakable, something that had once been human but was now lost to a nightmare of its own making. A few months ago, these streets had been full of life. People had rushed to work, to school, to stores, unaware that they were on the verge of extinction. But that was before the virus had swept through, turning every living thing into a mindless, flesh-hungry monster. The outbreak had been quick, and for the first time in history, humanity had been forced to confront its own fragility. The undead were everywhere, and yet, even now, long after the virus had consumed the last of the living, they roamed these streets, aimless and searching. In the heart of the city stood a once proud statue, now defaced with streaks of blood and grime. A monument to a civilization that had fallen, its purpose lost in the chaos that had followed. Zombies wandered around it aimlessly, their movements jerky, their eyes vacant. They were no longer focused on the living, because there were no living left. They were now wandering ghosts of their former selves, cursed to wander the earth with no goal, no end in sight. But there was something different about this place. As the wind picked up, an unsettling sensation washed over the empty streets. The air seemed to hum with anticipation, as if something was stirring beneath the surface. It wasn't just the wind. Something was wrong. The zombies, once driven solely by hunger, now seemed to be restless. A low growl rumbled from one of them, a pale figure standing motionless near a storefront window. Its bony hands gripped a rusted crowbar, its jaw slack with decay. It turned its head slowly, as if sensing something in the distance. And then, without warning, the first zombie lunged at another. The two creatures collided with a sickening thud, their gnashing teeth slamming into each other. They tore at one another's flesh with a desperation that hadn't been seen since the earliest days of the apocalypse. It was not hunger that drove them now, but rage. They fought with a ferocity that spoke of something deeper, something more primal than the need for sustenance. The streets, once a symbol of human progress, had become a battleground for the undead. The city had long been abandoned, but the monsters that remained had turned on each other. They had no understanding of why or how it had come to this. They only knew one thing: they were no longer content to feed on the flesh of the living because the flesh of their own kind had become their new prey. The wind howled louder, and the conflict between the two zombies grew more intense. The one with the crowbar swung it wildly, knocking its opponent to the ground. It stood over its fallen foe, its chest heaving with exertion. But before it could finish the job, another zombie appeared from the shadows, its eyes fixed on the pair. This one was different. It was smaller, quicker, and more agile than the others. Its movements were swift and calculated, as though it retained a sliver of its former humanity. It paused for a moment, watching the two monsters wrestle, and then it struck. With a sudden, fluid motion, the smaller zombie lunged forward, its teeth sinking into the neck of the crowbar-wielding creature. The larger zombie let out a gurgling scream, struggling beneath the weight of its attacker. But there was no escape. In a matter of seconds, the two were locked in a brutal struggle, tearing at one another with a viciousness that seemed to defy reason. And as they fought, something began to stir deep within the hearts of the other zombies nearby. It was as though a spark had been lit. The fight between the two monsters had awakened something in the others. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, more zombies turned their attention to the brawl. The first few were cautious, hesitant. But then, like a wave, more and more joined in. Some moved with a limp, others dragging broken limbs, but all of them were drawn to the violence. It wasn't long before the entire street was filled with the sound of clashing bodies and gnashing teeth. The creatures, once content to wander aimlessly, had found a new purpose: destroying each other. And in the midst of this chaos, the silence that had once defined the city began to fade. The wind carried with it the unmistakable sound of violence, of monsters tearing into their own kind. But even as the streets became a battleground, there was something haunting about it. A feeling that this fight, this desperate, senseless struggle, was only the beginning. The streets, once empty and still, were now filled with the terrible echoes of a world gone mad. As the sounds of the undead ripping into each other echoed through the city, the chaos only seemed to grow. The streets, once a symbol of human life and progress, had transformed into a savage arena where the monsters that had once terrorized the living now turned on each other with a blind rage. In the midst of the carnage, one zombie, different from the others, stood motionless. It had been watching the violence unfold with what could only be described as a cold, calculating curiosity. Its eyes, clouded with the remnants of what might have once been intelligence, flickered as the battle raged on. This one, dressed in a tattered suit, had retained more than just the instinct to hunt and kill. It moved with purpose, as if it was searching for something, or someone. The city's streets were no longer empty in the traditional sense. There was a constant ebb and flow of undead moving between shattered windows and overturned cars. They fought for dominance, their instincts taking over, but there was something unsettling about how they fought now. It was not merely the frenzy of hunger, it was as though they were fighting for control of something deeper, something primal. Among them was another figure, a solitary survivor. Isaac, a man who had managed to avoid the worst of the undead chaos, now found himself witnessing the horrifying transformation of the once civilized world. Having spent weeks hiding in an abandoned apartment building on the outskirts of the city, Isaac had finally been forced to venture out in search of supplies. He knew the danger, but the hunger in his belly and the aching thirst in his throat drove him forward. The air outside was thick with the stench of decay. The sun had set hours ago, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and warp unnaturally across the cracked pavement. Isaac had learned to move quietly over the past few weeks, blending into the shadows like the ghost of the city itself. But tonight, the stillness in the air felt different. The usual groaning and dragging of the undead were replaced by a low hum, a terrible sound of something shifting beneath the surface of this broken world. Isaac moved cautiously down the street, his eyes darting from side to side, always alert for the slightest movement. He had encountered zombies before, but something about this night felt wrong. The streets, now filled with the restless, were not just crawling with mindless hunger. They were fighting each other, something Isaac had never seen before. It was as though they had turned on their own kind, desperate for something that no longer existed. The sound of a distant crash broke his concentration. A building on the corner of the street had crumbled, sending debris scattering in all directions. Isaac flinched, his heart racing. The noise was enough to draw the attention of the nearby zombies, and a few of them began to shuffle in his direction. He knew it wouldn't be long before the entire street would be swarming with undead. Isaac ducked behind a nearby car, praying that the shadows would conceal him. He could hear the moans of the approaching zombies, but there was something different about their tone tonight. The usual guttural growls were mixed with something else, a low, almost human-like scream, filled with frustration and rage. Isaac's eyes widened as he realized what was happening. The zombies weren't just fighting for food, they were fighting because they were angry. The violent struggle between the undead had escalated, their bodies slamming into one another with a brutal force. It was as though something had driven them to madness, and they no longer cared for the survival of their species. In the dim light, Isaac could see the brawl shift from a frenzy of bites and scratches to something more organized. One by one, the zombies fell into an unspoken hierarchy. He watched as a large, imposing zombie, its body twisted and malformed from the decay, approached the brawling horde. It was different. This one moved with purpose, not like the aimless undead Isaac had grown used to. The others stepped aside as it passed, some even bowing their heads, as if acknowledging its dominance. Isaac held his breath, watching as the imposing zombie stood over the chaos, its dark, empty eyes scanning the battleground. It was a king among monsters, and in that moment, Isaac understood that the zombies had evolved. They were no longer just mindless predators. They were something else now. The realization sent a chill down Isaac's spine. These creatures, these once human beings, had found purpose in their existence, and that purpose was no longer just to consume the living. They had become something darker, something more dangerous. The fight for survival had taken a terrifying new form, and it was clear that the balance of power had shifted. The towering figure of the dominant zombie let out a guttural roar, and with that sound, the fighting halted. The others stepped back, waiting for their leader's next move. Isaac felt a cold sweat prick at the back of his neck as he stared at the horde of undead. The once empty streets had become a battleground of monstrous proportions, and Isaac was caught in the middle of it all. The fight for supremacy among the undead had only just begun, and he could already sense that the city's darkest days were still ahead. The tension in the air was palpable. Isaac remained crouched behind the car, his body rigid with fear, watching the scene unfold before him. The towering zombie, the one with the crowning presence, had begun to assert its dominance over the others. With a guttural roar, it silenced the chaos around it, and now the remaining undead stood in a tense stillness. It was as if they were awaiting some form of command, waiting for their leader to decide what came next. Isaac's heart pounded in his chest. He had seen many horrors during the months of the apocalypse, but nothing quite like this. The idea that these monsters, once driven only by the instinct to feed, had developed some kind of social order, some kind of hierarchy, was almost too much to comprehend. The dominating figure, now clearly the leader of the horde, turned its head slowly, scanning the other zombies with its lifeless, clouded eyes. There was a moment of stillness, a strange kind of unity among the undead, and then, just as quickly, the leader's gaze shifted toward Isaac's hiding spot. For a fleeting second, time seemed to slow. Isaac felt his breath catch in his throat as the creature locked eyes with him, its vacant stare cutting through the shadows. His instincts screamed at him to move, to run, but his body froze, caught in the grip of the creature's gaze. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the leader looked away, seemingly disinterested. It let out another low growl, a command to the others, and the rest of the horde began to shuffle away. Their collective movement was slow but purposeful, each zombie adhering to the unspoken command, their movements synchronized in a grotesque mimicry of order. Isaac exhaled in relief, his hands trembling from the sheer tension. He knew this brief moment of reprieve wouldn't last. He had no idea how long he could stay hidden, how long this uneasy peace among the undead would endure. The knowledge that the creatures now operated with a kind of hierarchy, like a tribe or a pack, was unsettling. It was as if the very fabric of the world had unraveled, and in its place, a new kind of darkness had emerged. The streets had become a dangerous maze. As the leader and its followers moved deeper into the city, Isaac cautiously emerged from his hiding place. His mind raced as he weighed his options. Should he try to find shelter in one of the nearby buildings? Should he stay hidden until the night passed? The thought of wandering the streets alone in a city overrun by organized, intelligent zombies filled him with dread. But he couldn't stay in one place forever. The world had changed. And survival in this new reality would require more than just avoiding danger. It would require adapting, finding a way to fight back. Isaac moved with quiet urgency, staying close to the buildings to avoid detection. His eyes scanned every corner, every alley, as he navigated the city that had once been his home. The ruins of civilization were all around him, burned-out cars, shattered glass, abandoned stores, and yet, in the midst of the devastation, Isaac felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. The unsettling stillness of the streets was broken only by the occasional shuffle of a lone zombie. They seemed to be moving in a more coordinated fashion now, almost as if they were searching for something. Isaac couldn't shake the feeling that they were no longer wandering aimlessly, as they once had. They had purpose, a drive to achieve something. And whatever it was, Isaac had a sinking feeling it was far worse than anything he had faced before. He paused, taking cover in a nearby alley. His breathing was shallow as he crouched behind a broken vending machine, trying to make sense of what was happening. Could it be that the zombies were evolving? Becoming more than just the mindless, decaying husks they had been at the start of the outbreak? The thought sent a chill down his spine. But as he peered down the alley, something caught his eye. The familiar figure of the zombie leader appeared again, this time flanked by two other undead. They moved with purpose, their eyes scanning the area with unnatural precision. They were searching, just as Isaac had feared. Isaac's blood ran cold as he realized what this meant. The zombies, once content to wander the streets aimlessly in search of prey, were now hunting with intent. They had become predators with a clear objective: to dominate, to control. The leader stopped in the middle of the street, turning its head slowly from side to side. Then, with a sudden, violent motion, it raised its arm. The two zombies accompanying it immediately dropped to all fours, their movements sharp and fast. They began to fan out, searching for any signs of life. It was as if they had become a hunting party, working together to flush out their prey. Isaac's pulse quickened. He had to move, now. He could hear the shuffling footsteps of the approaching zombies, their search for him becoming more desperate. He knew he couldn't outrun them. But if he could outsmart them, maybe he had a chance. He glanced around, his mind racing for a plan. The old bookstore on the corner was a few steps away, its windows shattered but its door still intact. It offered a sliver of hope. If he could get inside, maybe he could find some supplies and figure out his next move. With a deep breath, Isaac dashed toward the bookstore, moving quickly but carefully, staying low and quiet. His feet hit the cracked pavement softly, and his eyes remained trained on the door. But just as he was about to reach it, the sound of footsteps froze him in place. One of the hunting zombies had caught sight of him. Isaac's heart raced. It was only a matter of seconds before the others would notice him, too. Isaac's pulse hammered in his ears, his entire body rigid with fear. The zombie's eyes locked onto him, its hollow gaze burning through the darkness like a predator's. The air around Isaac seemed to freeze as time stretched out in a nightmarish slow motion. He had no choice but to act, now or never. Without a second thought, Isaac turned and bolted toward the alleyway, his legs pumping furiously beneath him. He could hear the creature's heavy footsteps thudding behind him, growing louder with every stride. The smell of decay and rot followed in its wake, a nauseating reminder of the nightmare he was living. The creature's gurgled growl filled the air, an unholy sound that made his skin crawl. It was no longer just a random zombie chasing after him, it was a hunter, and Isaac was its prey. His feet hit the cracked asphalt with a pounding rhythm as he sprinted down the alley. The buildings on either side loomed like jagged teeth in the darkness, their broken windows staring back at him like hollow eyes. His breath came in sharp, painful gasps, and his legs burned with the effort of maintaining speed. He couldn't afford to slow down, not even for a second. Behind him, the zombie's footsteps echoed with terrifying precision, its groans growing more urgent. Isaac's mind raced, trying to think of a way to escape, but his options were limited. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to disappear. The streets were a maze, but every corner led to more danger. He had been cornered once before, and the memory of it still haunted him. He couldn't afford to make the same mistake again. His eyes darted ahead, scanning for a way out. He saw it, another alley branching off to the right, just ahead. It was a narrow passageway, but it was his best shot at evading the relentless zombie. Isaac veered toward the opening, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't dare look back. The sound of the pursuing undead grew louder, its raspy breath closing in on him. Isaac reached the alley and whipped around the corner, praying that he could lose his pursuer in the labyrinth of debris and abandoned structures. The narrow path was choked with discarded items, old crates, rusted pipes, and chunks of broken concrete. He pushed through the clutter, trying to make as little noise as possible. But the alley wasn't empty. Ahead of him, a group of zombies shuffled slowly, their decaying forms silhouetted by the dim moonlight. They hadn't noticed Isaac yet, but if he wasn't careful, they would. Panic surged through him as his heart rate skyrocketed. His only chance now was to move swiftly and quietly, no mistakes. He pressed himself flat against the wall, hoping the shadows would shield him. He could hear the undead groaning and shuffling in the distance, their movements slow but purposeful. They were looking for something, someone. Isaac clenched his fists, his knuckles white with tension. If he could make it past them, he might just have a chance to reach the old bookstore. But the odds were quickly stacking against him. From the corner of his eye, Isaac saw the first of the zombies in the alley turn its head. It sniffed the air, its grotesque face twisting as its hollow eyes locked onto him. His stomach dropped like a stone as the creature took a shuffling step toward him, its mouth opening in a silent snarl. The other zombies followed suit, turning in unison, their decaying bodies jerking toward Isaac's hiding spot. The silence of the night was shattered by the scrape of dry, rotting skin against brick as the creatures moved forward. Isaac's breath caught in his throat as the first of them got closer, its hands reaching out toward him, its mouth opening in search of flesh. He needed to move, and fast. In one fluid motion, Isaac darted forward, pushing off from the wall and bolting deeper into the alley. He didn't have time to think, didn't have time to look over his shoulder. The zombies began to shuffle after him, their uneven steps echoing in the narrow space. Isaac ran with everything he had, weaving through the clutter of the alley, praying he would find an escape. The sound of the pursuing zombies grew louder, but Isaac refused to slow down. He could feel his strength starting to wane, his muscles burning with fatigue. His throat ached from the lack of air, but he pushed on, focusing only on the sound of his footsteps and the ever-growing horde behind him. There was no room for hesitation. Up ahead, he saw a break in the alley, a street lamp glowing faintly in the distance. The entrance to the old bookstore was just a few yards beyond it. He had to make it. If he could get to that doorway, maybe, just maybe, he could lose them. But just as hope flickered in his chest, his foot caught on something, a broken bottle hidden in the debris. He stumbled, his body pitching forward as he struggled to regain his balance. The noise was enough to alert the undead. The first zombie in the group behind him let out a guttural growl, and within seconds, the entire horde was charging toward him. Isaac's heart thudded painfully in his chest as he pushed himself back onto his feet, forcing his legs to move even faster. He reached the street lamp, the warmth from its light flickering across his face. Just a few more steps. But before he could make it to the doorway of the bookstore, a hand shot out from the shadows, grabbing him by the ankle. Isaac screamed in panic as he was yanked backward, his body crashing to the ground with a sickening thud. He struggled against the grip, but it was no use. The zombie that had grabbed him was too strong, its rotting fingers digging into his skin. Isaac kicked out wildly, but the creature's hold only tightened. With desperation rising in his chest, he reached for anything he could use as a weapon. His fingers brushed against a jagged piece of broken glass on the ground. He grabbed it, his hands trembling as he swung it toward the zombie's face. The glass cut through its decayed skin, but it wasn't enough to stop it. The horde was closing in, their groans growing louder. Isaac had moments, if that, to escape. To be continued. Isaac's heart was pounding in his chest as he fought with every ounce of strength he had left. His body was screaming in pain, his lungs burning with the effort of running, but there was no time to rest. His hand gripped the shard of glass with desperate force, his knuckles white. The zombie's rotting fingers tightened around his ankle, pulling him back toward the hungry mouths of the oncoming horde. The creature's face was inches from his, its decayed skin hanging in loose, revolting folds. Its breath was hot and fetid as it snarled, exposing blackened teeth. Isaac swung the shard of glass with all his might, the jagged edges slicing into the zombie's face. The thing howled in pain, momentarily loosening its grip, and Isaac wrenched his leg free, kicking out with his boot. The zombie staggered back, but it wasn't enough. More were coming. With no time to think, Isaac scrambled to his feet. His mind raced, but all he could think about was survival. The bookstore was so close, but the undead were relentless. He darted toward the doorway, using the last reserves of his strength to push himself forward, ignoring the screaming protest of his muscles. His feet pounded the pavement, and his eyes locked on the bookstore's door. But just as he reached the threshold, a guttural roar echoed through the air. Isaac whipped around, breath catching in his throat. The leader of the undead horde had reappeared, its hulking form stepping out from the shadows. The towering zombie was moving toward him with terrifying precision, its cold eyes fixed on Isaac. It wasn't like the others, it wasn't following instinct anymore. It was hunting him with purpose. Isaac froze for a moment, his body gripped by fear. The creature's massive, gnarled hand reached out, and Isaac knew that if it touched him, it would be the end. His mind raced as he weighed his options, but there was no time to think. The leader was almost upon him. Without thinking, Isaac lunged into the bookstore, slamming the door behind him just as the first of the zombies reached it. His breath was ragged as he stumbled into the dark interior. The musty smell of old books and paper filled his nostrils, mingling with the stench of death that clung to his clothes. The place was a mess, shelves had collapsed, glass and debris littered the floor, and the once quiet space now felt like a tomb. Isaac's hands were shaking as he pressed his back against the door, trying to steady his breath. The zombies outside growled and clawed at the door, their insatiable hunger filling the air with a deafening noise. But for the moment, Isaac was safe, at least, for now. The door was solid, but he knew it wouldn't hold forever. He needed a plan. He stumbled deeper into the bookstore, searching for anything that could be used as a weapon or a tool. His eyes scanned the aisles, desperate to find something, anything, that could help him. But the shelves were bare, save for a few tattered books. The world outside had been destroyed, and even this small haven had been ransacked. Isaac's mind was spinning. He couldn't stay here. The zombies would eventually break through, and he couldn't risk being trapped in the dark. But where could he go? The city was crawling with undead, and the leader of the horde was still out there. It had seen him, and now it was hunting him. Then, through the silence, he heard a noise, a faint scraping sound coming from the back of the bookstore. Isaac's body went rigid, his pulse quickening. Was it more zombies? Or something else? Cautiously, he moved toward the noise, his eyes darting around the room, searching for any sign of movement. The sound grew louder, closer, until he saw the source, a figure, huddled in the far corner of the bookstore, its face obscured by shadow. Isaac's heart skipped a beat. It was another survivor. He approached cautiously, his footsteps light against the creaking floorboards. "Hello?" Isaac called softly, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "Are you all right?" The figure didn't respond immediately. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, slowly, the figure turned, revealing a face that was covered in dirt and blood, yet still human. Isaac took a step closer, his gaze fixed on the stranger. The figure's eyes were wide with fear, but there was a flicker of recognition in them. It wasn't a trap. She was just as scared as he was. The woman stood slowly, her movements hesitant. "You're not one of them," she whispered, her voice shaky. Isaac nodded, his body still tense. "No, I'm not. I'm just trying to survive." The woman's eyes darted to the door, where the sound of the undead scratching against the wood was growing louder. She looked back at Isaac, her expression pleading. "We can't stay here. They're going to get in. I've seen them do it before." Isaac felt a chill run through him as he realized the truth of her words. The zombies outside weren't just mindless killers, they were organized, coordinated. And if they were determined enough, they would find a way through. The door wouldn't hold forever. He had to make a decision. "I know," Isaac said, his voice firm. "But we can't just give up. We have to find a way out of here. Together." The woman nodded, her eyes flickering with a mix of fear and determination. "We'll find a way. But we need to hurry. They'll be in here any minute." Isaac glanced around the bookstore, searching for any way out, any escape route. The back door? The windows? He had to think fast. The leader of the zombies was still out there, and Isaac could hear its growls, low and menacing, as it waited for its prey. There was no time to waste. Isaac's mind raced as he scanned the dimly lit bookstore for any sign of an exit. The air was thick with the tension of impending doom, and the low groans of the zombies outside seemed to grow louder with every passing second. He could hear them clawing at the door, their nails scratching against the wood, desperate to get in. The woman, still wide-eyed and breathing heavily, glanced at him, her gaze pleading for a solution. "We can't stay here," she said again, her voice trembling with fear. "If they get in, we won't survive." Isaac nodded grimly. She was right. They needed to get out of the bookstore before the zombies breached the door. But where could they go? The streets were crawling with the undead, and nowhere seemed safe. The realization hit him hard: they couldn't just run out into the chaos. They needed a plan, something that would give them a fighting chance. He moved to the window at the back of the bookstore, pushing aside the tattered curtains. The glass was grimy and cracked, but it offered a glimpse of the street outside. Through the broken glass, he saw the dim outline of abandoned cars, overturned trash cans, and the eerie silence of a city long forgotten. A few shadows moved across the street, and Isaac's stomach twisted as he saw the unmistakable shuffle of the undead. "Great," he muttered under his breath. "More of them." The woman, whose name Isaac still didn't know, joined him at the window, her eyes scanning the street. "Is there another way out?" she asked, her voice filled with desperation. Isaac turned away from the window, thinking hard. His mind briefly flashed back to his time in the city before it all fell apart, the city he used to know. But that was before the outbreak, before the world descended into chaos. Now, every corner was a death trap, every alleyway a potential ambush. "We could try the back door," he said, the words sounding hollow in the air. "But I don't think it'll be much safer than the front." The woman shook her head. "It's too risky. If they're outside already, we'll never make it. We need a different route." Isaac looked around the bookstore once more, his eyes landing on the back of the room. Near the rear exit, there was a narrow staircase leading down into what appeared to be the basement. The space was dark, and the only sound was the distant shuffle of zombies outside. Isaac hadn't noticed the stairs earlier, but now they seemed like a possible escape route. "Wait," Isaac said, pointing toward the staircase. "We can go underground. There might be an old tunnel or something, some way to get out without going through the streets." The woman's eyes widened. "Tunnels," she echoed, her voice a mix of disbelief and hope. "You think there's a way out down there?" Isaac nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure. It was a long shot, but it was their best option. "I don't know for sure, but it's worth checking out. If we don't find anything, we can always head back up. But we can't stay here much longer." Without waiting for a response, Isaac moved toward the stairs, his steps hesitant as he approached the dark passage. He reached for the rusted doorknob that led down to the basement, hesitating for just a moment before turning it. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow, shadowed staircase that descended into the darkness below. The smell of dampness and mildew filled the air as Isaac squinted into the gloom, trying to make out what lay ahead. The woman followed him, her footsteps soft but determined. "You really think there's a way out down there?" Isaac didn't answer right away. He was already stepping onto the first creaky step, his ears straining for any sound. The groans of the undead still echoed through the air, but they seemed to be getting further away for now. The bookstore's atmosphere had shifted from an impending doom to something more tangible, an opportunity. "I don't know," Isaac said quietly. "But it's our best shot. We have to try." The woman nodded, her expression resolute, even though fear still clung to her features. She moved down the staircase beside him, the faint light from the bookstore's front door barely illuminating the path. The stairs were old and uneven, and Isaac's footfalls sounded loud in the oppressive silence. He could feel his pulse racing in his chest, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. They were about to head into the unknown, with no idea of what awaited them below. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, Isaac's hand brushed the stone wall, feeling the cool dampness seeping through the cracks. The basement was pitch black, but he could make out faint outlines of old furniture, forgotten boxes, and dusty shelves. The musty smell was almost unbearable, but Isaac pushed forward, his instincts telling him to keep moving. At the far end of the room, he spotted what looked like an old wooden door, its edges rotting and faded from years of neglect. It was barely visible, tucked away in the corner. Isaac's heart skipped a beat. Was this it? The way out? He approached the door cautiously, the woman following closely behind. He could hear her breathing behind him, quick and shallow, and he could feel her nerves in the air. They had no idea what lay beyond this door, but there was no turning back now. Isaac reached for the handle, his hand trembling slightly. As he pulled the door open, a blast of cold air hit his face. He stepped into the next room, and his breath caught in his throat as he took in the sight before him. Beyond the door was a narrow tunnel, barely wide enough for two people to walk side by side. The walls were made of old brick, and the floor was covered in dirt and debris. The tunnel stretched far into the distance, disappearing into the unknown. Isaac looked at the woman, his expression serious. "This is it. We go down this path, we don't stop until we're out of the city." She nodded, her face pale but determined. Together, they stepped forward into the darkness, leaving the bookstore and the dangers that awaited them above, behind. To be continued. The cold air of the tunnel wrapped around Isaac like a damp shroud, and every step he took felt heavier than the last. The passageway ahead stretched endlessly, its darkness seeming to consume all light from the narrow opening they had just come through. The smell of earth and decay filled his nose, and the sound of his footsteps echoed off the rough stone walls, amplifying the silence that had settled between them. Isaac glanced at the woman beside him, her face a mixture of fear and resolve. She kept her eyes on the path ahead, her every step tentative but steady. Isaac didn't know her name, but in this moment, names didn't seem as important as survival. What mattered was that they both made it out of this hellish city alive. The tunnel was old, its brickwork crumbling in places, revealing gaps where the walls had started to erode. Small puddles of water gathered on the uneven floor, reflecting the weak light from their fading surroundings. The further they walked, the more the temperature seemed to drop, a chill that crept under their clothes and made their skin prickle. But Isaac knew they couldn't afford to stop. Behind them, the sounds of the horde, their growls and groans, were slowly fading, but he had no illusions. They hadn't escaped, they had only bought themselves a little time. He stopped for a moment, trying to listen for any movement from behind, but the tunnel swallowed all sound, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. He looked to the woman. "We need to keep moving," he said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. "If we stop, we might not get another chance to get out." She nodded but didn't speak. Isaac could tell she was scared. They both were. But the fear didn't paralyze them, it pushed them forward, forcing them to move faster. Isaac's heart beat in his chest like a drum, matching the rhythm of their steps. He tried not to think about what was waiting for them at the end of this tunnel, if there even was an end. All he knew was that this was their only option. The further they ventured, the more oppressive the air felt, thick with the smell of mold and old, stagnant water. The tunnel twisted and turned, and the dim light from behind them was soon swallowed entirely by the darkness. It was now just the two of them, stumbling through the unknown. Isaac's mind began to wander, and for a brief moment, he thought back to when things had been normal. Before the outbreak, before the world had been turned upside down. He had lived in this city once, had known its streets, its parks, its people. He used to take leisurely walks through the downtown area, grab coffee at his favorite cafe, and chat with friends at the bar. Now, that city was gone, replaced by this nightmare. He clenched his fists, fighting back the sting of loss that threatened to overtake him. There was no time to dwell on the past. Survival was all that mattered now. His thoughts were interrupted when the woman, whose name still escaped him, suddenly stopped. Isaac nearly collided with her, his body jerking forward in surprise. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low, trying to keep his panic in check. She stood perfectly still, her face strained in concentration. Isaac's heart skipped a beat. Had they been followed? Had the zombies found them? The woman turned her head slightly, her gaze fixed on the far end of the tunnel. Isaac squinted into the darkness, trying to make out what she saw. And then, he heard it, a faint, low sound that didn't belong to the undead. It was like the echo of something, moving. Isaac's pulse quickened. It wasn't a zombie. Not like the others. "It's not a zombie," she murmured, almost to herself. "It's something else." Isaac narrowed his eyes. The sound was getting louder now, and he realized that it wasn't just a distant noise, it was closer. Much closer. A heavy, dragging sound, followed by what sounded like a low growl. Before he could react, the woman grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the wall of the tunnel, away from the source of the sound. "We need to hide," she whispered urgently. "Now." Isaac barely had time to process her words before she was tugging him toward a small alcove in the wall. The space was cramped, and as they crouched down into the shadows, Isaac felt a new sense of dread settle over him. Whatever was out there, it wasn't like the zombies they had left behind. The noise grew louder. Isaac's heart pounded in his ears as he strained to listen, trying to make sense of the growing sound. It was almost like something, or someone, was dragging itself along the tunnel floor, its movements slow but deliberate. And then, through the darkness, a figure emerged. It wasn't human. It wasn't a zombie. It was something in between. Its skin was mottled and pale, stretched too tight over its bones. Its eyes were bloodshot and wild, and its mouth hung open in an eerie, silent scream. It moved with jerky, unnatural motions, dragging its left leg as it stumbled forward. It had the appearance of a person, but the unmistakable stench of death clung to it, and there was something deeply wrong about its very presence. Isaac's breath caught in his throat. What was this thing? The creature stopped just a few feet from them, its head turning from side to side as if it was sniffing the air. Its breathing was ragged and wet, like it was struggling to take in air. It shuffled in place for a few seconds before letting out a low, guttural growl. Isaac held his breath, praying that it hadn't heard them. But his luck wasn't on his side. The creature's eyes locked onto them, its gaze cold and unblinking. The woman beside Isaac gasped, her body tensing as she tried to remain as still as possible. Isaac's mind raced. There was nowhere to run. Nowhere to hide. This was it. And then, the creature took a step forward. Isaac didn't think, he acted. He pushed the woman behind him, drawing his makeshift weapon from his belt. He wasn't ready to die here, not like this. "Stay down," he hissed, his voice barely audible. The woman didn't protest. She crouched lower, her breathing shallow, her eyes wide with terror. Isaac's grip tightened around the weapon as he prepared for what came next. The creature's growl echoed through the tunnel, reverberating off the stone walls as it took another slow, deliberate step forward. Isaac's heart hammered in his chest, his hands trembling as he gripped his makeshift weapon, a jagged piece of broken metal that had once been part of the bookshelf in the bookstore. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. The woman behind him was barely breathing, her body crouched in a tense, silent crouch, her eyes fixed on the grotesque thing that loomed in front of them. Isaac could feel her fear, almost as if it was his own, but there was no time to comfort her. There was no time for hesitation. He had to protect her, had to make sure they both got out alive. The creature's eyes locked onto them again, its unblinking stare piercing through the darkness. It moved forward with another ragged step, its legs jerking unnaturally as it dragged its mangled body closer. There was no mistaking it now, this was no ordinary zombie. This was something worse, something far more dangerous. Isaac's mind raced as he tried to think of a way to fight back. He couldn't take this thing on alone, not without a plan, not without something more than a broken shard of metal. His pulse was pounding in his ears, and every second felt like it was stretching into eternity. The creature let out another growl, its mouth opening wide, revealing rotting teeth that gleamed in the dim light. It was getting closer, closer to the point where Isaac would have no choice but to make his stand. And then, in a split second of instinct, Isaac acted. He lunged forward, swinging the broken metal at the creature's face with all his strength. The impact was like hitting stone, and for a brief moment, Isaac felt his grip slip. The creature reeled back, a snarl escaping its throat as it staggered, temporarily disoriented. Isaac's heart leaped with hope. He had an opening. He quickly pulled back, ready to strike again, but as he did, he heard a low hiss from behind him. Without warning, the woman surged forward, a sharp object gripped in her hands, a piece of broken glass, the edge glinting dangerously in the low light. Isaac barely had time to process what was happening before the woman drove the glass into the side of the creature's neck, her face set with determination. The creature let out an inhuman shriek, its hand shooting out to grab her wrist, but it was too late. The damage had been done. The woman twisted the glass deeper, and the creature's grip slackened as it let out a final, choking gasp. It stumbled back, its eyes wide and filled with a rage that seemed to burn even in death, before it collapsed to the floor, lifeless. Isaac stood there, breathless, his body trembling from the adrenaline coursing through him. The woman stood beside him, still holding the broken glass in her hand, her chest rising and falling rapidly. They were both panting, their hearts still racing from the close encounter. For a moment, the silence in the tunnel felt deafening. The creature was gone, but the danger wasn't over. Isaac knew they had only bought themselves a moment of peace, and the thought of what else might be lurking in the darkness made his stomach churn. Isaac turned to the woman, his voice hoarse. "That was close." She nodded, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand, her eyes flicking nervously toward the tunnel's opening. "I didn't think I'd make it out of that alive," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Isaac wasn't sure how to respond. He could feel the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on him, but now wasn't the time for reflection. They had to keep moving, had to stay ahead of whatever else might be hunting them. He turned and took a step forward, keeping his eyes on the dark tunnel ahead. "We have to get out of here. Now." The woman didn't hesitate. She followed him, her steps slower now but still determined. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, and with each passing moment, the weight of the situation seemed to grow heavier. Every step they took brought them closer to an uncertain future, but they had no other choice. They couldn't stop now. As they continued down the dark passageway, Isaac's mind kept turning. They had come so far, but they weren't out of danger yet. The city was still overrun with the undead, and every corner could be their last. But for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt a spark of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in days: hope. Maybe they could make it. Maybe there was still a way out. Isaac glanced at the woman again. "We'll get through this," he said, his voice steady, despite the uncertainty swirling in his gut. She gave him a small, tired smile. "I hope so." They continued down the tunnel, the flickering light of their dimly lit surroundings barely illuminating the way. But in that moment, with the sound of the creature's death still echoing in the air, they both understood something important. They had survived. They had fought back against the dark. And they weren't done yet. The end.